Hello everyone, I'm here to talk to you today about generative listening and in fact to present you the 7 principles for generative listening. Now I talk about generative listening, it's a kind of deep listening, it's a kind of attentive listening. I call it generative listening because it generates something very new that was not there in the people that entered the conversation. As I mentioned, 7 principles. Let's start with principle number 1. It's about slowing down and noticing all that is present. Very often we enter a conversation thinking about a meeting we've just come out of, thinking of problems we've just left behind, or we might be entering a conversation thinking about what we feel this conversation must produce, or what we feel or know needs to happen afterwards. We may have another meeting, we may have a train to catch, we may have something happening after the conversation, which means that we're not entering the conversation fully, we're not present to it. We're still rushing from a past conversation or preparing to rush for a next meeting. This first principle is about slowing down, and in doing so, and to help us do so, noticing everything that's present around us. Grounding exercises, noticing who's there, noticing the colours, noticing the feel of the room, whatever can help us ground and be present to the conversation. Second principle is about listening with all my senses. Now, we're often used to thinking of listening as something we do with our ears, sometimes with our eyes, by noticing body language. Now, I believe that we can, and in fact we need to listen with all our senses. An expression such as, this has left a bitter taste in my mouth, points to the fact that other senses are at work when we listen. Listening activates various senses in the human body. And it's important to do so because it also helps us move out of or move beyond just the brain or the conceptual activity of listening to a real empathetic activity in listening, to really being present with all my senses to the other and to what the other is saying. Third principle, listen to the words and listen to the images that the other person is choosing. When we speak, we choose words, we choose images, often consciously, often also unconsciously. But whatever way we choose them, these are the words that we're bringing to the conversation. They convey particular meanings, particular images. Some of them are very strong, and it's very important to remain attentive to those, to not try to translate them in our mind. And give them an equivalent word that we would feel more comfortable with. No, whatever the word is, whatever the images are, they're the ones that have been brought to the conversation. We need to honor them, we need to welcome them, and we need to see what they're telling us. Fourth principle, listen to the emotions that the person who's speaking is experiencing. And you will be able to do that by, of course, as principle number 3 tells us, by listening to the words and the images. They're often full of strong emotions. But of course you will also listen to the emotions by watching body language, by listening to the tone of the voice, by changes in the tone or in the pace of the voice. You'll also listen to the emotions when suddenly somebody slows down and stops speaking, the voice is breaking, or conversely when somebody starts speaking very fast and maybe in a very animated way. Whichever way, the tone, the body language, silences, all these convey emotions that we need to be attentive to in a generative listening way. Principle number 5 is about suspending judgment. Whatever the other is saying, that's what he or she is bringing to the conversation. It's her perspective on the world, his or her experience. We need to honor that. We don't need to agree with it, but we need to honor it and suspend any moral judgment that we might have by thinking this is good or this is bad, this is true or this is false, this should happen or this shouldn't happen, etc. When we do this, we have a moral judgment. In a generative listening, we need to suspend these. Now, another judgment that we need to suspend, and maybe we're less used to it, is what I called cognitive judgment. Cognitive judgment is when I tend, for example, to assume what the other one is going to say, and you can witness this whenever somebody is finishing your sentence, either directly or maybe in their mind. They're finishing your sentence. They're prejudging what you're about to say. It's as if the conversation's already happened in their mind. Now, this is cognitive judgment, and we need to suspend this if we're to be present to the other and to what the other is bringing. Another type of cognitive judgment is, for example, when we rationalize what's being said according to what we believe the other person is. For example, we might say, well, of course he's saying this, he's French. Or we might say, yes, well, of course she's saying this, she's a woman. Whatever reason or justification we're bringing to what somebody is saying, this is some kind of cognitive judgment that we need to suspend. Principle number 6, don't assume that you've understood, and therefore check that you have understood correctly. So don't hesitate to ask a question such as, well, when you say this, do you actually mean this way or do you actually mean that way? I'm not sure I've understood. This requires us to be humble, but it's crucial. Too often, way too often, we assume that we've understood something when in fact we haven't, and we need to remember that when somebody is trying to convey something through speaking, they themselves may not quite understand what it is they're getting at. They might be discovering what they're trying to say by the very act of saying it. So don't assume they know what they're saying, and don't assume that you know what they're saying. Be humble. Okay, principle number 7. Pay attention to what's going on within you. Notice the emotions in you as the other person is speaking. Whatever somebody else says in a conversation will impact us. It will trigger in us emotions, strong emotions, and if we're not attentive to those emotions, we run the risk of responding from a place that is not helpful for the conversation. We may suddenly respond very angrily, or we may disregard a whole aspect of what somebody else has said because it's too much for us. Therefore, we're not present to the conversation because we're not present to ourselves. We're not present to what the conversation is generating in us. So principle number 7, notice what the emotions are so that you can really be clear about what belongs to what the other one is saying and what belongs to you, what has been triggered in you when the other person has spoken. Okay, so these were the 7 principles for generative listening, and I'd like to invite you now to make the best use of them. Enjoy yourself.